Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Historical Society program since February 2020. It just seems like yesterday. But great turnout tonight. Appreciate everybody coming out, and welcome back, I should say. We also have 4 distinguished guests tonight from Pendleton, Indiana. If they would wave to the group, okay, I see 2 of them, maybe the other 2 are, okay. All right, so they got the word that Lizzie was speaking tonight, so they made a beeline down here. Just kidding. But they were very interested in the program, so welcome Pendleton, appreciate that. I want to thank the Carnegie Center for hosting tonight's meeting. And with that, of course, thank Lizzie too for the program that she put together. We are going to dispense with any of the business portion of the meeting tonight, except for one thing, and our treasurer is in the back of the room. And at the end of the program, he'd love to take your $10 for membership this year. Not too many people have paid for this coming year, right, Bob?
Not many.
Not many, okay.
Many tonight, all the first part of the year.
So Bob is back there at the end of the meeting. If you'd like to re-up with the dues, they're $10. Next month's program is entitled, it's about the Freedom Land Cemetery. And our own Pam Peters, I believe, will be part of that talk and discussion. So that will be a very nice event. I don't have my calendar with me, but it should be September 28th. Okay. And that will be at the Strasbourg Auditorium at the library. Fingers crossed. So we will just see how it goes. Also, the Pageant Museum, our Historical Society Museum, is open now. It's open on Saturdays from 1 until 3. And we're highlighting an exhibit from the White House department store. So if you are a native New Albanian or have been around for about 40 or 50 years, I'm sure you've heard of the White House department store. So we do have a display down there at the museum along with our By the River's Edge exhibit too. So that's on Saturdays from 1 until 3. I don't know if this is really the official way to do it, but I'm going to pre-adjourn our meeting tonight. So after the program, it'll be over. So therefore, you don't have to listen to me again after the speaker. That'll be it. But at this time, I would like to call on Vic McGinnity, our Vice President of the Historical Society, to introduce the speaker for us tonight. Vic?
Okay, Dr. Elizabeth, is that correct?
Grennan, Browning.
Browning. She has a BS in political science from American University in Washington, D.C., an MS in history from University of North Carolina, and a PhD in history, University of North Carolina. She's a former Indiana University Resilience Institute as we almost need a light up here sometimes, don't we? As a Midwestern Indiana Community History Fellow in 2018. She's been profiled in Who's in America multiple times. Research has spanned a broad range of environmental histories from the interconnecting stories of urban renewal and Superfund remediation in East Chicago to Midwestern farmers' decisions made regarding resilience practices. Throughout her project, she has worked to bring public discourse about climate change through public history engagements. Let's welcome Dr. Elizabeth Browning.
Hi everyone, thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction. I will say I'm actually, there might be another Elizabeth Browning out there because I have my PhD from UC Davis back in California. That's where I came from before Indiana. But I was at Midwestern for undergraduate in Chicago, so I kind of traded the Midwest and California back and forth. Just to make sure you know I'm not posing as another Elizabeth Browning. But I do hail from Indiana University in Bloomington. And that's right, I've been there since 2018. And I can speak louder too. Lean closer, okay. Hello, is that better? Okay. But first, I really want to thank David Barksdale for inviting me here to speak to you all, and really just his generosity in sharing his expertise throughout my research for the exhibition. I also want to thank Pamela Peters and David Longest for sharing their expertise in New Albany area's history. And a special thanks to Julie Leitner for all of her help, especially the technical details today, and everything she did to put the exhibition together for us here at the Carnegie Center, and Laura Wilkins of the Carnegie Center and Floyd County Library as well. So this evening, I want to start the evening by acknowledging and honoring the indigenous communities native to this region, and recognize that the former Monon Railroad was built on indigenous homeland and resources. I recognize the Chippewa, Delaware, Kaskaskia, Kickapoo, Miami, Ottawa, Peoria, Piankashaw, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Wyandot people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And I do that very intentionally as well, because I'm going to talk a little bit later in the presentation about how the Monon Railroad ties into Indigenous history in interesting ways, especially in its marketing. But I wanted to open with that. So the title of the exhibition, which I hope you had a chance to all go and look around, and I'm hoping to end a little early, so if you haven't had a chance yet, we can do that. But Hoosier Lifeline became a slogan for the Monon around the 1950s. And when you look at a map of the Monon route and think about its role in driving economic development and social connectivity in the state, its role as a lifeline truly is clear. But one moment in New Albany's regional history that I'm sure you all know very well, and I think it makes especially clear the Monon's historic role as a vital lifeline, was the historic and devastating flood of 1937. And I have a WPA video clip detailing the relief efforts by the flood, but my PowerPoint is not working with me. So I hope you can envision this in black and white. But thinking about the Monon Railroad as essential for transporting foodstuff to refugee camps during the flood of 1937, and for transporting refugees out of the disaster zone during the devastating flood, there were newspaper articles from Indianapolis and Lafayette explaining how the general manager of the Monon Railroad, whose name was Frank E. Lewis, the manager at the time, provided free transit for refugees from the flood zone to Crawfordsville, Lafayette, and Bloomington, among other cities. And here's a quote from the Indianapolis Star from January 26, 1937. Quote, "Using all of its facilities south of Bloomington, the Monon has suspended all other operations south of there, and food and fuel are being shipped to the distressed areas." It was announced by Mr. Lewis. A total of 3,275 refugees have been taken from the flood district, with 750 going to Salem, 850 to Mitchell, 700 to Bedford, 600 to Bloomington, 300 to Paoli, and 75 to Pekin. Am I pronouncing that right? Pekin? Thank you. Sorry. I'm still, sometimes I run into Indiana pronunciations, and I grew up on the West Coast, so I'm adopted Indiana as my home very proudly, but still, some pronunciations get me. Major T.J. Crooks of Indianapolis was in charge of evacuation of flood victims. And in an article in the Journal and Courier of Lafayette, Indiana, wrote about details about the arrival plans for the transport of flood refugees from New Albany to Lafayette. Quote, when the train arrives over the Monon, the refugees are to be taken to the courthouse, given physical examinations, and segregated according to sex and color. If ill, hospitalization will be provided, end quote. So refugees were transported in boxcars. They often didn't know where their train was going, and they were separated from their family. So you can imagine it was a very traumatic experience on this journey, but also a relief for those refugees. So I wanted to open with details from this traumatic time in New Albany's history to underscore that the Monon literally was a lifeline in these moments of crisis. But not just these moments. It's crystal clear in the example how the Monon served the community, but when we think about the services that it provided day in and day out, we see the many layers of the notion of a lifeline. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about the exhibition and what inspired it, and kind of the vision that myself and my co-curators had, and I'm going to talk more about the legacy of the passenger and freight service of the Monon. But since we're talking about the legacy of Indiana's railway and infrastructure more broadly, I just wanted to take a quick moment, a quick aside with a few reflections about our national discussion on infrastructure from a historical perspective. It's obviously very much in the news these days and highly debated. So I don't want to get into the politics of it, but I think it's a nice moment to kind of just stop and reflect on what exactly infrastructure is. And for me, in the historical research that I'm doing, well, first let's see if I can pull up a clip from the drone footage. Let's see if we can find this. Yeah, my PowerPoint is not cooperating with me here. But this is the footage that's in the gallery, our drone footage from the Monon line. Oh, let's see. I wanted to play this in the background for you because there's a lot of infrastructure in it. So it's kind of nice to have in the background. We'll see if it loads here. But I'll continue while that loads. But when you have a chance to view this, if it doesn't pull up, it starts in the south here in New Albany. And then we travel through the small agricultural town of Monon, which has a population of less than 2,000. And finally, we reach the northernmost terminus at Michigan City along the sand dunes of Lake Michigan. So part of what inspired me and drew me to the Monon was that it covered all this terrain in Indiana, this really diverse landscape. Ah, there it is. Okay, so that's nice. I can play in the background for a little bit. This probably looks familiar to you. And my partner, Reuben Browning, is a film editor and videographer, so he was able to help me with this drone footage. And yeah, we traversed the state in well, it ended up being 2 days, but I did the bulk of it on the first day. But as you watch that and you think about how infrastructure has shaped this nation, right, and the state and these communities, it's really remarkable when you kind of reflect on that. So as a historian, I study environmental history, U.S. environmental history, and the history of environmental justice, broadly conceived. And so I'm always thinking about this from two important angles. The first is addressing our warming climate. And Vic mentioned that in the introduction, that it's something in my public history work that I'm really interested in, thinking about climate change from a historical perspective. And the second is addressing the hardening social divides over racial inequality in our nation. And infrastructure, again, in my opinion, it needs to account for the inefficiencies and the inequities of past generations and work toward reducing carbon emissions and rebuilding with equity at front and center. So back in March of this year, the American Society of Civil Engineers graded U.S. infrastructure at a C-, which is a bit disappointing. And in 2019, the World Economic Forum ranked the U.S. 13th in the world for overall infrastructure. So clearly there's a lot of improvement that needs to be done, and we see it every day in our commutes and in our time moving about. And you've likely followed the news a few weeks ago that the Senate passed this bipartisan infrastructure bill that calls for new federal spending of $550 billion, which is part of this $1 trillion bill that renews existing transportation spending. And this spending is going to go to so-called gray infrastructure, right, like roads, bridges, and railways. But again, I think we need to think about policymakers in the past and in the present might be tempted to pursue an apolitical, quote-unquote, strategy when it comes to infrastructure. But American history has shown that this strategy is impossible, right? A historian would argue this is always political, right? Infrastructure is integral to defining political belonging, and it's always shaped tensions between private capital and public welfare. And I'll also note, again, as a scholar who works on interdisciplinary studies of the environment and the changing environment that we live in, this is really a signal moment for our addressing this socio-ecological problem of climate change. And it's kind of this once-in-a-generation opportunity to shift our infrastructure toward more resilient ends. There's a saying that everything has a history, right? And so seeing this infrastructure debate play out is really fascinating to think how we got to where we are today from a historical lens. Okay, so I think we made it to Michigan City. I'm glad that you're able to see some of this footage here. Okay, I'm gonna go forward here. Let's see. Should be able to just, oh, there we go. Okay, so, pardon me while I get my bearings on this. So in the last year alone, the United States faced 22 extreme weather and climate-related disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion each. This is a cumulative price tag of nearly $100 billion. And so this underinvestment in resilience in terms of infrastructure has harmed American transportation, it's disrupted service, it's made travel conditions unsafe, and it's increased maintenance and operating costs. Moving forward, we also need to pay heed, as I mentioned, to equality within our systems of infrastructure and adjusting injustices and how these systems were designed and how they've operated. So you can see here the construction of Interstates 65 and 70 in Indianapolis, and they passed through areas that have been redlined, which was a discriminatory practice that began in 1933 with the formation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which deployed this color-coded scheme to designate risk for mortgage lending. Neighborhoods were shaded in red to deem that they were quote-unquote hazardous, and people living there were ineligible for government-backed home mortgage loans. But on this map, you get a sense of where people were displaced and homes and businesses were demolished. There were 17,000 residents displaced and about 8,000 buildings in Indianapolis. So it's important to note kind of the past, how these communities have been affected, and maybe think about what we can do about that moving forward. This is an old slide, so I apologize. This was the proposed funding for transit, but now with the Senate bill that passed, it's $66 billion for railways, and I want to now zero in here on railways. So this would be the biggest investment in rail travel in more than a generation, and it has the potential to bring public commitment to rail transportation back in line with the levels of investment that road and air travel have received over past decades. The New York Times reported recently on these investment disparities and how they've helped contribute to a dominant car culture in the United States. Over the last 65 years, the US has spent nearly $10 trillion in public funds on highways and roads, and just a quarter of that amount on subways, buses, and passenger rail. Since the early 1980s, Congress's transportation bills, which amount to multi-billion-dollar investments every few years, the vast majority, which has gone to highways and roads, about 4/5 all told of that funding. So this makes sense on paper, as about 80% of Americans' trips are by car or by light truck, compared to just 3% by mass transit. But the historical patterns of government commitment to roads and highways, which largely began with the creation of the interstate highway system in 1956, have much to do with why our cities and suburbs are these sprawling environments that require a car to get around. It's also partly the reason why transportation is the sector most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, about 30% of America's greenhouse gas emissions to be exact. much of which is from the hundreds of millions gasoline-burning cars and SUVs. Of course, Amtrak is really excited about this bill. And Amtrak is the largest passenger rail provider in the US, and it said that it plans to expand service and upgrade existing tracks with as many as 30 new routes. Of course, the Northeast Corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston sees steady ridership, and they need some maintenance there as well. But also expanding access to other cities. So, for example, I was looking up traveling from Cincinnati to Chicago by rail. There's only one train that runs a day, and the train departs at 1:41 a.m. So you have to be ready in the middle of the night, there in the morning, early morning. And the trip takes 9 hours. In June 2019, Amtrak canceled the Hoosier State train between Indianapolis and Chicago after the Indiana General Assembly voted not to approve the $3 million a year needed to keep the train going. So this left the only Amtrak option between central Indiana and Chicago as the Cardinal, which operates between Indianapolis and Chicago 3 days a week. Amtrak projects that with the new funding, there'll be new connections for Indianapolis, increased service to Chicago, new routes to Cincinnati and Louisville, as I'm sure you've heard. But yeah, you see some kind of missed opportunities as well between the route between Indianapolis and perhaps Nashville. Anyway, so it's interesting to kind of see what this map is looking like right now, how it's taking shape. But traveling by rail is up to 83% more energy efficient than driving, and up to 73% more energy efficient than flying. So it's important to consider the possibilities of how that could help with our current crisis. Okay, so now I want to zero in a little bit more on Indiana here, and when it comes to freight, so we've talked about passenger service, which the Monon was obviously famous for in its heyday, but it was also a very important form of transportation for freight. And railways are really critical to Indiana's economic operations, as I'm sure you know. In 2019, Indiana's manufacturing industry accounted for 27.4% of state GDP. This is 2.7 times higher than the US average and the highest of any state. And the slides that I have here are from the Indiana Department of Transportation, which is updating the state rail plan, and federal law requires that it's updated every 4 years. So this is kind of a nice snapshot of where Indiana rail is right now. Freight tonnage, this is from 2018. Freight rail accounts for 13% of freight tonnage in Indiana, with key industries relying on rail to be competitive, including automotive, chemicals, metals, grain, and mining, both coal and limestone. And you can see here that trucking is the overwhelming favorite for transporting freight in this state. Here's just a snapshot of those industries that I mentioned. And it's kind of interesting if you go through the exhibit and think about the freight that we cover. You see the limestone and coal and grain, obviously, but that's changed over time as well. This is a snapshot as well of where Indiana is ranked nationally. So 4th in the number of freight railroads, 11th in total rail line mileage. So you can see just how significant rail is for Indiana. So I'm going to jump forward here and talk a little bit about the exhibition. And it was truly an honor just to have an opportunity to work with my curators and co-curators and the artists, and I've listed them here. So now that we kind of have this sense of the contemporary reliance on rail that we have and the importance that it still really is a lifeline for our state, this exhibition might make a little more sense to you of how it came about. So the exhibit began as a discussion with myself, a historian, with Maria Whiteman, who is an artist, and she works with me at the Environmental Resilience Institute, and Betsy Sturrett, who is the IU Grunwald Gallery of Art director, and Eric Sandweiss, who is a fellow historian. He's a professor of history at IU Bloomington. So we were interested in bringing the rich literature of the Anthropocene to the people of Indiana. And that's a framework within the environmental humanities that discusses anthropogenic climate change and its impacts on our culture and on our lifestyles. And anyway, to give you a sense of kind of the framing of the exhibition. And the exhibit really has two deeply interconnected parts. The first is the historical context that considers the Monon's underlying environmental, economic, and political contours. And second is the gorgeous photography that I hope you've got a chance to see, documenting the places that the Monon reached and looking for new ways for us to connect, to make community, and to resituate our relationship with natural landscapes. So the third artist who I haven't mentioned yet is Richard Koenig, who he grew up in Bloomington, and he's now at Kalamazoo College. He's a professor of art there. So he has these amazing vintage photographs from his time living by the Monon, and he went and photographed the northern portion for this exhibition. It was really a joy to get to work with all of these people. So the exhibit uses this old right-of-way of the Monon as a means of building this new understanding of the interplay of local landscapes, ecosystems, and social communities across time and space. Here is a website on Carnegie, so right here. And before we were here, we were at the IU Grunwald Gallery in Bloomington. So when you look at a map of the Monon, this is a 1904 system map. It's incredible to think how extensive the passenger and the freight traffic on the state's railroad were in its heyday. This map from 1904, it shows this. At the time, it was called the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railroad. It had over 100 stops and over 600 miles of rail entirely within Indiana. Here's kind of a cleaner, simplified map. I had a great time looking through maps for this exhibit, really. A lot of the Indiana State Library and the Indiana Historical Society. I love this map because this is the one we used in the entrance to the exhibit. It gives you a sense of the connectivity that is always part of this Monon marketing, and it shows you the major rail lines that it connected with. You might have also seen in the exhibit, we use these bookends of New Albany in the south and Michigan City in the north, and you see the contemporary drone footage juxtaposed to the archival footage. So that was a really fun way to see how the landscape changed over time. So this is Michigan City. We tried to get just the right angle to replicate these, but that was a challenge. Another image showing the connectivity that the Monon really prided itself on. The Pullman Palace, you could take the Pullman to Florida. There was advertising even how you can make your way to Cuba, through the Monon. So it's kind of incredible how they thought about it. This is also a great graphic. This is 1955, the annual report. You can see where all of the connections might take you. So the Monon, this is my favorite lifeline image as well. So I came across this in the Indiana State Library, and I thought, this is the name of our exhibit. This is what sold it for me. But it's just kind of a beautifully simple representation. So the Monon, it's really a story of economic development and technological progress, no doubt. And this is a story that we kind of hear retold time and again. And it's really the popular narrative of the time, that kind of grew up with the Monon. But as a historian, I kind of always have to take that critical lens and think about, perhaps who the Monon did not serve, right? And it's interesting to kind of think about it from that perspective as well. So let's see. Sorry, I apologize. There, I'm going to hop ahead to this here. So you can see the marketing here from 1946 really relies on the sense of the Monon's connection with indigenous history and the sense that kind of lends some authenticity to it, right? The Monon is an Indian word meaning swift running from Potawatomi language. So this was a really striking advertising for me to see. And in the exhibit in Bloomington, I went more into this story about indigenous dispossession in Indiana. We kind of go into the deeper history of Indiana and what it took to, clear that landscape. Think about it as a blank slate, right? But there was this violent dispossession that happened before Indiana could come about, right? So And then another key story that I look at is this story of the Underground, that there's often this misconception that the Underground Railroad was an actual railroad, which it was not. But in the case of the Monon, escaped slaves who crossed the Ohio River did use the tracks of the Monon to make their way north to Salem. And the first president of the Monon, James Brooks, was a Republican who is believed to have offered freedom seekers passes to ride the rails in their efforts to travel further north. And I know there's a wonderful exhibit about the Underground Railroad here, so it's kind of a nice tie-in between my exhibit and the museum here. There's also, we can think about the Great Migration, which from 1916 to 1970, African Americans left economic deprivation and racial discrimination in the Jim Crow South for northern cities. And the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville, as the Monon was known for much of that time, was one of the many routes north. And it took African Americans to smaller cities, among larger cities like Chicago, and allowed them to find industrial jobs and new homes in the north. So the railway also offered opportunities for limited employment. Black Pullman porters provided vital labor on sleeping cars, dining cars, and parlor cars, and they were an important catalyst of the civil rights movement through participating in the first all-black union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was formed in 1925 under the leadership of A. Philip Randolph. So here's a nice image as well from that experience. So again, when we think about access to the railway, it was not equal for all people at all times, right? And I think that story was really striking to me as I looked more and more into the Monon. And I came across this Fairbanks School public health study from IUPUI, which tracks life expectancy along the Monon Trail in Indianapolis. And for me, this was such a startlingly clear kind of inscription on the landscape still of kind of the legacy of how we think about infrastructure and how it actually operates, right? So this showed, this is the former Monon Railroad that's now been turned into the Monon Trail for pedestrians. And the Indianapolis metro region, this is from 96th Street to 10th Street. And the researchers found that although these endpoints were just 28 miles apart, they're worlds apart in terms of health expectancy. So there's a 14-year difference in life expectancy from the north to the south. At the north end of the trail, which is a white affluent area of Noblesville, the life expectancy is 83.5 years. And this incrementally decreases as you move south until you reach 10th Street, the urban core of Indianapolis, just south of Monument Circle, where the life expectancy is 69.4 years, and the population is largely low-income communities of color. So health and life chances are directly tied to social and economic policies and the various layers of infrastructure that they create. And the social legacies of this infrastructure really continue today. So thanks for your time and interest in the exhibit, and I hope this gives you a little more insight to my interest and why I wanted to study the Monon. And I'd love to take any questions if we have time. I hope I didn't run over too long, David.
I think we're fine on time. Maybe a few questions. Yes.
I read upstairs where these cars were air conditioned. Is that?
Yes.
How did they accomplish that?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what year that would have been that they were actually air conditioned. I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look. But yes, of course, and then they had for freight, refrigerated cars were in place for some time. So yeah, it's important on days like today.
She knows more about the one I didn't about that particular.
1947 is what you said? Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Excellent.
Air cooled.
Yeah, that's.
For passenger service, how long were the cars segregated? Do you know when they?
That's a great question as well. I don't know when they were desegregated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would have been 1950s, 60s. Are there any other knowledgeable? That's a great question. Yeah, I would need to look further into that. Yeah.
Any others? John?
We've got the Chicago, Indianapolis, Louisville Railroad, we've got the Monon name. What's the juxtaposition of whether to switch or?
Oh, yes.
interchangeable?
Names.
Yes, so the Monon is kind of its nickname for many years, even as it was the Chicago, Indianapolis, Louisville. It officially changed in, let's see, 1956. But that's, I see some nods. Okay, that's good. I know it's in the 1950s. And, you know, there were many mergers, and as all railroad histories go, it was kind of a messy, there were booms and busts at different times. It got, eventually, you know, it was sold to the CSX Corporation. That's what the former line is now under control, but yeah.
What year did they have the Monon Centennial here? In the 40s?
47.
47. That's right, David, were you there as a? No, you have materials.
I have materials, yes, I have materials.
Oh.
Vic was there.
Yeah, Vic, were you there?
Not quite.
Not quite, okay. Yes.
I have a question that's actually about the baseball and the basketball team upstairs.
Oh, yes, okay.
I knew nothing about that.
Yeah.
So,
Tell us who you are.
I'm Stephanie Vines. I'm with the Monon Railroad Historical Society in Salem, Indiana, the Depot
Okay.
Railroad Museum.
Nice
So,
to meet you. Yeah.
I'm going to corner you after this.
Yes, excellent, okay.
I've never seen or heard anything about that. There were intramural softball teams, of course, but
Yes.
I just wondered what you knew.
You know, the extent of that was really, I did not research beyond the photograph. I have to say, it was, I was looking for representation of employees. So that would be worth investigating a little bit more about if there was a league or, yeah, who they played with.
Yeah, that was, I thought that was great.
Yeah.
Greg, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm Greg Sekula with Indiana Landmarks, and some of you may know, we just last week announced our 10 most endangered historic places list for 2021, and included on that now for the second year is the Monon Depot in Bedford, which is featured up in the exhibit, photographed in a couple locations, but a building that, you know, currently is vacant. The city is trying to figure out what to do with the building. It's in a fairly, what I would call, you know, industrial area just north of downtown that really needs kind of a visioning plan for what's going to happen. But there is very, very strong interest amongst the Indiana Trails community on perhaps seeing that building function as a trailhead for some of the trail systems that are envisioned along that segment of Monon. So, you know, keep your eye on that, because we're hoping we'll see a positive outcome for that historic building.
That's great. That's great to hear. Thank you for sharing that.
John? And then Kelly, I'll get to you next.
My grandparents moved from Boone County, Indiana, to Albuquerque in 1819.
Okay.
Several families of them, and including my grandparents. And the women and some of the older people that came along were on a Monon, looks like a boxcar, with the door cut inside and one window. I'm sure it wasn't real plush. I imagine they were on wooden benches, I don't know, but anyway, I was surprised when I saw Monon on the, in Albuquerque.
Do you have a photograph of that, or have? Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Oh, okay. That's great. Oh.
Something to share. Kelly?
Do you have any idea of the impact interurbans had on Monon passenger travel during the peak of the interurban activity, which ended around 1932, which had lines running from many of these cities?
Yeah.
So do you have any numbers? Do you have any idea of what the impact
Yes, in fact, I had some great images of the interurban to show the competition. I don't have them on this presentation, but I know by 1920, passenger rail, the numbers of passengers dropped in half. Yeah, from the previous decade. So it was a significant drop. And I think just the ease and the accessibility and it was just much more coverage in the Indianapolis area, right? And so that.
From an environmental point of view,
Yes.
interurbans were really a cleaner means of transportation.
Absolutely. Right. Right. That's a great point.
Thought I saw another hand, yes.
Next Monon employee, when you were speaking of African Americans, especially porters, it always struck me as a little bit strange. I started working in 1962. That there were, I can only name one or two African American employees that actually worked on the Monon. And it always seemed, it struck me as a little strange, and I don't have any answers for why.
That's interesting. Right, and I don't have the numbers for that. Definitely, Chicago is much more the hub for home importers. But I know there were some in Indiana, but you're right, not.
They did do the dining car service quite a bit,
Okay.
but,
Yeah.
you know, when they suspended dining car service, which was fairly, you know, the 50s, and so they didn't call it service.
Well, the Monon's going up through an area of Indiana where there was no black people. In the rural areas, and still today, there's a lot of rural areas without black people.
Right, right. Yeah, it's.
Don?
The route map shows from going north from Louisville, very specifically avoid going straight to Indianapolis. Because west of that, with any Chicago being thrown out.
That was Mr. Brooks' goal, to go from Albany to Mississippi. They acquired the tracking later on to go from Indy, across Monon to Chicago.
So they didn't
But they're going on now.
That's right, yeah, that's from my understanding.
At one time, they had considered building from Gulfport to Indianapolis, and they quit that. In fact, the road, that railroad was built, was at Pennsylvania, was built on that bridge.
And the reason too that the route is crazy is that up into Borden, they follow an old road bed that the state of Indiana had dug out and they couldn't afford to finish. So they took that project over. Then from Borden to just north of Bedford, they would purchase the property or get usage rights and this is with the rails or trails, this is a big problem they're having because there's property records, you can't find them or you don't know what the agreement was. Then from like just north of Bedford on, they use what would be eminent domain, which is why from there on out it gets a little more straight, but that's why it goes over to Orleans and skips Mitchell, because no one in Mitchell wanted to buy any bearer bonds. So they just went over to Orleans, so they just go over and back.
Well, again, oh, one more, okay.
Real quick, you mentioned today's rail service, you mentioned Amtrak. Do you see any other passenger service that you would like to see put into service?
That's a great question. Right, I think going back to the interurbans and the efficiency of that, you know, a light rail kind of system, and I'd be intrigued to see that come into play. Yeah, especially, it'd be interesting to go back and look at the history of the interurbans a little bit more and see if that might be an inspiration, yeah, for passenger rail.
Okay, well, Lizzie, thank you so much. Great.